divorce can set back your balance sheet for a long time. It takes a huge toll. And depending on when you're getting a divorce, if it's later in life, it may be that math you just can't recover numerically. Your rates of return on what you have left in the smaller share that presumably both of you have. So often it will if later in life, it will definitely put a permanent dent in your estate.
Welcome to Life's Third Act, an enlightening look at estate planning, retirement, and beyond.
So here we are, the third and final episode of this topic of death and divorce. We hope that you found it useful. I can tell you we've been amazed at how much there is to say on this topic, and more could be said, and I'm sure in the future will be. But we know that many of you out there are hurting in ways that relate to a divorce, whether it's anticipated, whether you're in a divorce, maybe you've emerged from a divorce. Many of you may be in past 50 or so years old, but even if you're not, this has implications for your later in life planning as well as your estate plan for children and beyond. So this is a rich topic that I think will meet some of those needs, and we encourage you to stay tuned. So with that, let's get into episode 3. But it is to call your attention to an alternative to divorce for those of you who are in the position to make the decision. We'll assume that you are the person who's about to file. If you're not, then of course this isn't in your hands. But you can still raise it to the other side. Right. So you can still go to your husband or wife and say, look, there is an alternative to divorce if this is your primary concern.
Right. I mean, it's especially if the concern is financial in nature. It's, well, I don't like what you're doing with this, or I don't like what you're doing with that. Still get along, still both great parents, no concerns about that sort of stuff, but it's just, I don't like the decisions you're making from a financial planning standpoint. Okay, well, why don't we take care of that? You can take care of that element without a divorce. And I think that, sometimes, as you said at the very beginning of this, we're not here to divorce people who don't need to get divorced. We're here for people who need our help to help them. And so if we can provide an alternative way to help them where maybe they can keep their family intact, but they can address the concerns that they have about their relationship and what's going on, particularly when it's a financial concern, that's another avenue that we can provide to them so that, maybe they can keep that marriage intact and address that sort of isolated problem that maybe they had.
Yeah, and that could actually, for just what would this look like on the ground? It might look like each party, they divided up assets. Each party controls assets in his or her account, and you live the balance of your life that way. It could involve the parties together taking assets and transferring them to an independent entity like a trust in which they would not be a trustee. This is a common solution. So both parties sign off on that. So it's very likely to be protected by the court later on if challenged. So at that point, you've truly locked down the deal because it's an irrevocable trust and it has very specific terms, and neither of you, meaning you nor your spouse, may be the ones, and probably would not be the ones who would be trustees. You could be a co-trustee, for example, and some independent party be another. But the point is, this is a way to address those things without feeling like you have to go to court because of these financial concerns in order to protect your estate or your later in life financial needs. Let's mention, though, the next step short of divorce, just while we're on this topic. There is a step beyond that. Let's assume you can't get the cooperation of the other side for a postnuptial agreement that gives you adequate assurance. So in that case, there is something short of divorce. There's this intermediate step, and that intermediate step, which exists in most states in some form, and that's a legal separation. Let's take a few minutes and talk about that, at least from Missouri's perspective.
Yeah. So with a legal separation, the biggest difference is in a divorce in Missouri, we say that the marriage is irretrievably broken and cannot be preserved, right? That's our magic language. In a legal separation, the language is that the marriage is not irretrievably broken and can be preserved, okay? Huge difference, right? The number of words, not a huge difference, but the conceptually is a big difference. But what we do in that is between the two are very similar. we're dividing up the assets. We're addressing custody if we need to. We're addressing support if we need to, but we're not dissolving the marriage.
And that's the only thing you're not doing. In other
That's
words,
the only difference.
Yeah, and these are words of reassurance that it keeps intact the marriage, but it divides in a very final way all of the assets, so that even if you die and you're legally separated as opposed to just living apart,
Big difference.
Yeah, I'm 90% sure of this. The court would not be qualified to take against the will if there's a legal separation.
Correct.
Yeah. So in other words, you have all the protections you would otherwise have, and I often would argue to clients that, look, rather than saying, why would I bother getting a legal separation, assuming marriage is important to you for reasons beyond practicality, then I would say, why not? Because it will give you, in Missouri at least, and to some extent in other states, but we'd have to look at the rules of each state. But in Missouri, and there are other states like Missouri, you're completely protected. And you do get this division of assets in a final way that assures that there will be no further claims, legitimate claims, even after your death, to those assets. The post-nup, it can give you lots of security. It's very attractive because you're not spending a lot of money on lawyers. You have a lawyer on each side to help you with the deal, but it's not like,
it's not like full-blown litigation.
Yeah,
No.
A legal separation will look from the outside like a divorce because you settle all these things, and sometimes in the same way, meaning, you may go to court and have a trial. But as you point out, it's one very important difference to people of faith for whom divorce is something they simply don't want to do. For those people, that what may be a technicality to some is very important to others. So I always like for clients to know about that option. Now, but one thing to be clear on the post-nup, can still be challenged if there's later a divorce. But if it's done properly, the court's going to approve it. But as I said a while ago, if you all jointly agree to move assets into a trust, say for the benefit of the children or something, I don't see any way that a judge is going to be able to undo that transaction, absent clear fraud or something. But there is a little uncertainty. You'd agree there's a little uncertainty with a post-nup. You can have a fairly high level of confidence. I'm not suggesting that it doesn't that it's not a smart move. I would argue for most people it is a smart move if they have the concerns we mentioned. But you just need to know that it's not been judge tested, it's not been trial tested the way legal separation's been through court. The judge has brought the gavel down. It's done. I mean, in terms of your practical concerns, they're addressed. With a post-nup, there's still, you need to take care to assure that you have a lawyer who understands the law in this area and who assures that the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. But assuming that's done correctly, then that would be a marvelous estate planning tool that would allow you to keep your marriage for many of you who want to do that, but you have these practical concerns.
Yeah, with the postnuptial agreement, it's also important to make sure that both sides have attorneys. That's one of the biggest factors that, in my experience, and I've had a couple prenups and postnups, but one of the big things that the court looks at is, are both sides represented? Because, look, these are pretty specific contracts. And so you want to make sure, and the court wants to make sure, that you actually understand what you're agreeing to relative to what you would otherwise receive. And that goes back to what we were talking about how these contracts are to deviate from what the assumption would be under the statutes.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So really important to have good representation there, somebody who knows what they're talking about, and they can advise you adequately so that you understand, okay, this is how this differs, and this is how this meets my goals and what I want.
And it's, if you think about the circumstances of a deal like this is the stereotypical case that's ripe for exploitation. Mm-hmm. You have an intimate relationship. You have a relationship of trust. For there to be some sort of coercion, some sort of improper influence, this is the classic scenario where that could happen. And often you'll have this substantial disparity in bargaining power between the two parties. Again, to use stereotypes, you might have one that is is a financial whiz and maybe runs a business, and the other who's had nothing to do with business and maybe does more of the domestic things. I mean, that was kind of the classic scenario where much of this law evolved, this case law that we have relating to this, and even the statutes. They came from recognizing, these one party can come in and stick under the nose of the other this paper and say, "Oh, sign this." It's who knows what they say it is,
Right.
and all of a sudden they've signed away everything. So the judges are protective, and there should be an exclamation point on this on the point you just made, is that you've got to assure, even it's better that you don't pay for it. If you pay for it, be sure the attorney knows that they're not representing you, they're representing the other side. Insist on the other side having a lawyer.
And and look, the other attorney has that obligation, right, ethically, to represent their client, okay, even if the other spouse is paying for it.
And which sometimes it's not unusual.
It happens, right?
Yeah.
Especially, frankly, with a postnuptial agreement, you're already married. So most of the funds, absent some other crazy circumstances, they're already marital funds.
They're already married. When the guy or the gal writes a check.
Right. Doesn't matter whose name is on the check, is marital funds. But it is important, and it's important to do all the steps, right? Having both sides having counsel, full disclosure of your assets, right? You don't want to hide anything. Be like, oh, well, I don't want to talk about this one thing that I have. Well, that's going to make it invalid.
Oh, notoriously. All it takes is this one thing that the guy or the gal decides, I don't want to disclose this property that I own in Virginia. He doesn't know about it. It's never come up.
Even if it's separate property, something they had beforehand.
Separate.
But you've still got to disclose that information.
And so often that becomes the crack in the door that allows opposing counsel to argue, look,
contest it.
This was a relevant asset. This is significant, and it would have affected his decision to sign this, for example.
Yeah.
So
you got to be careful with those.
Yeah.
Another point, when we were talking about legal separation, you mentioned individuals of faith, and that's usually when we have individuals come in and they say, well, I don't want a divorce. Mm-hmm. But something's got to change.
Yeah.
But when we're also talking about individuals who are later in life, it used to be more so, partially because of the way the laws were, and partially the way the insurance companies used to run it. But with older couples, one of the concerns used to always be, or often would be, continued health insurance coverage. If you get divorced, you can't cover your former spouse on your health insurance plan. It's just not possible, okay? You can't do it. But if you're legally separated, it used to be they kind of caught on to it a little bit, but some will still allow you to cover your legally separated spouse on your health insurance. And you may say, well, okay, health insurance is kind of costly, but it may not be a huge cost. But if it's a maintenance case, an alimony case, mm-hmm. that may be a way to minimize those additional costs and minimize your risk for maintenance or alimony, because if you can keep them on your health insurance plan, maybe it's an extra, $20 a month, or maybe an extra $100 a month. But if they have to go out and get their own plan at 70, 80 years old in a later in life divorce, it's very expensive.
That's a good point. And just to clarify, though, I think that you can continue coverage under COBRA for like 18 months.
Right, but COBRA also is very expensive.
It's a market rate, right?
Oh, yes. Yeah. COBRA is incredibly expensive.
And it's for how long? Is it 18 months or 24?
I'll be honest, we don't really deal with it that much because it's so expensive that it's almost cost prohibitive. So
just so people, though, won't be confused, what we're saying is that there's no way for you to get this incredible bargain coverage if you're the spouse that has the benefits that are coming through the employment of your spouse. Then once there's a divorce, then it's going to go to market rates as long as COBRA has to provide that, and then COBRA doesn't have to. So it's not a bargain whenever you're told, well, gee, the employer has to continue providing this for whatever it is, 18 months.
I think it's 18 months. I think you're right on that.
But it's not a bargain because it's market rates. So it means it could have been, in your example, $100 may go to $2,000.
Right.
So it is that's in today's age, even with Obamacare.
Yeah.
The Obamacare is often that option that exists out there as an alternative may not be nearly as good as what your husband or wife has in the workplace.
Especially if you have some pre-existing conditions, you have certain doctors that you like going to, you have certain medications that work best for you. those may not be covered under the market plan or under the alternative plan that you can get. Or if they are, that alternative plan is significantly more costly than what, might just be available to you, but it doesn't cover those things, or it doesn't allow you to go see that doctor that you've been seeing for the last 20 years for, whatever condition you might have.
Yeah, and that could be huge. People underrate that. The idea that you would go to a doctor like you would have somebody clean your car.
Right.
That's a very intimate and could be a very significant effect on your health care, because there are some professionals who will have enough knowledge about your health and enough experience with you that for them to transfer the records, I've talked to doctors about the nature of these records, and these records, and they say it's because of lawyers,
right.
but the records are very skeletal. They have phrases, doctors are in a hurry, so it's not the elaborate prose that it would take for somebody to be able to step in who's otherwise qualified, to be able to step in and give you the same quality of care. So that's important to people. And another thing that we'll mention, I guess we're wrapping up here. I'll give you a chance if there's something else we haven't hit on. But I really hate to think of people deciding to get divorced, for example, because of practical concerns. In other words, this isn't a case where they hate the other party. It's where there could be practical issues. It could be that the husband has a drug or alcohol problem and is spending the assets down. And, you feel like, the wife feels like, oh my gosh, I've got to take action. And there are a lot of divorces are of that sort of nature where—
Gambling addiction.
Yeah, gambling addiction, really common today. So the good news is to know that you can protect your estate plan and your balance of life concerns, meaning the remainder of your life concerns. You can protect them usually without a divorce. In most states, there are other options, and we've talked about them. I realize that in some states, you may not have those options as readily or as satisfactorily as we've described here, but certainly in most states they are. And I would be slow to choose divorce if, in fact, this is somebody you still care about and there's some positive things in the relationship. There's some hope that there will be repair. If there's any encouragement to be found in this relationship, then consider something other than divorce first. And then if you run out of alternatives, so be it. But we generally counsel to look at these alternatives. And especially, I realize if the concern is estate planning is what's driving it.
Right. Yeah. And that's the biggest thing with the combination of divorce and estate planning, and how they sort of coexist with one another. You really are focusing on your priorities, right?
Yeah.
What is most important to you going forward? And the sort of least extreme option is generally the best option. You don't want to take the extreme measure if there's some alternative that will meet your goals and allow you to continue moving forward.
And we shouldn't leave it unmentioned that the cost of this transaction, unlike estate planning, some may say, well, gee, estate planning is expensive. And it can be. If you're affluent and you're doing complicated trusts, you can expect to spend clearly north of $10,000, and sometimes maybe north of $20,000, depending on the size of your estate. I don't want to run off the rest of you. We'll have our clients dry up overnight. But for most people, it's a couple thousand, 3,000, whatever. But I want to emphasize what you get, the value of that for your family versus the costs associated with divorce. Divorce, it's not only is it an incredibly painful process, I think just by its nature, there's stress involved, it happens over time. There's uncertainty that's extended sometimes into years, normally not. Normally now courts are they've recognized the hardship on people whose lives are in limbo for that period. So they try to get it done in a year, maybe. But the point is, there are a lot of costs associated with divorce apart from money. But then when you throw in the money, which, depending on whether it's tried or not, I mean, you can easily spend 10% or more of a marital estate on the divorce. And there have been people who haven't had that much in assets, but you may say, well, how can they spend that much in arguing? They're arguing over children.
Yes.
I mean,
because look, I can do a cost benefit analysis of an argument over this account or that account or this house or whatever, because it's numbers, right? It's math.
You can measure it.
Right. You can't quantify, well, how much is it worth to you to spend that time with your child, to get that extra, maybe instead of 5 out of 14 days, you want 7 out of 14 days. Well, how much are those 2 days worth to you? Priceless, right? Like
priceless. That's like that commercial.
Yeah.
Was it MasterCard?
MasterCard. Yeah.
Priceless.
Always, we can line item all your assets, but when we get to time with your children,
and that is perhaps the best example in the world of priceless. Because so think about it. If you're a middle class guy and you're earning $60,000-$70,000 a year, you care as much, at least, about being with your kids as a guy who's making $1 million a year. So it costs, interestingly enough, it costs about the same amount. If you're going to do the things that should be done, it's going to cost about the same amount. Now, does the guy who makes $70,000 a year spend probably in a custody battle what the guy has $1 million will spend? Probably not. But it's only because the guy who's spending the $1 million is choosing to do a bunch of additional discretionary things. But if you were to talk about the core things, those fundamentals of what needs to be done, it's the same, rich or poor. So children, transcend the money of a divorce. I would say the most common reason that people spend more than north of, say, grab a number, $20,000 a year. Mm-hmm. I'd say the most common reason would relate to children. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's different scenarios, different complex asset cases where that's going to increase the cost of litigation. But when it comes to
a custody battle,
it can get very expensive.
And specifically, we're talking about custody battles. But go ahead.
And part of it has to do with just that inherent sort of perspective of the state that it's important for kids to be spending time with both parents. Okay. Yeah. Now, whether your state is a 50-50 presumption or it has no presumption, all states have a general public policy that it is important that there is a special relationship between a child and their biological parents. Yeah. That's why termination of parental rights is such a high standard. When you talk to that in the context of divorce litigation, I mean, I talk to my clients at the very beginning of the case, and I tell them, look, as much as you can talk to your spouse, because you're still married, talk to your spouse about, look, I have a phrase, it's kind of self-deprecating, which usually breaks the ice a little bit, but we can either pay for our kids to go to college or we can pay for the lawyer's kids to go to college, right?
It seems that most people want our kids to go to college.
Yeah, a lot. Well, a lot of people do, but it is true though that it can become, just to kind of bring us back to the point, it can become very costly to go through that litigation. So if there is a less expensive alternative, a less drastic alternative that will still help you reach your goals, that's something worth looking into.
And we can't drop the subject without giving an example beyond just children, because we realize that for many of the people who are doing this, they may be in their 50s and 60s, and it's not that issue specifically. But I want you to know that child custody issues can be hugely expensive. But one of probably the two other things that I'm curious what yours are. If I were called to add two other things that I would say are kind of the three most notorious reasons that people spend a lot of money in divorce courts. Number one, I'd say children. Number two, I think I would say a business owner, the cost of valuing a business, deciding how to allocate it, et cetera. So for business owners, always is a mess. Not always, but often. Then the third thing I'd point to is maintenance. And maintenance means one party's getting alimony. So you've got this difference in income in a fairly long marriage. So usually that party with lesser income is pursuing maintenance. And unlike child support or some other things in divorce, it's often a little squishy. So it invites litigation. Now that's my list. I hope it didn't influence you. Tell me what you would say summing this up.
So any issue where experts are going to need to get involved, those are the ones that really drive up the cost. So, with custody, we can get psychological experts. We can get a lot of issues just beyond the normal custody disagreements. It doesn't influence me, but you're pretty much spot on, because with businesses, again, involving experts, valuing the business,
and
arguing over the value.
Maintenance is expert.
And then maintenance, you get experts because you get into what is the person requesting maintenance? What are they capable of earning, right? Maybe they're not earning it right now, but what do they need? What's going to get them to a place where they're self-supporting? And so again, experts
occupational
can get
therapists,
right?
you have testifying, you have
it's opinion.
Yeah.
There's some science to it, but a lot of it is opinion. And when you get to things that are opinion driven, that cost can just skyrocket because there's no defined answer.
Yeah. So I took us a little bit on a side trail there, but hopefully that's of use to some of you. But let me sum up by saying, though, that divorce can set back your balance sheet for a long time. And that's the real point of this discussion the last 5 minutes or so, is that divorce can have a huge impact on your end-of-life plans, meaning your later-in-life plans, and your plans for the thereafter, the purely estate plans. It takes a huge toll. And depending on when you're getting a divorce, if it's later in life, it may be that math you just can't recover numerically. Your rates of return on what you have left in the smaller share that presumably both of you have. So often it will later in life, it will definitely put a permanent dent in your estate. Whereas if you are younger, it's still going to be less than it would otherwise have been, presumably. But yeah, there's some better chance to compensate. But you have to acknowledge the toll that's taken economically in a decision. Now, again, Cordell is in the business of representing people in domestic relations. So what I'm arguing is a little contrary to Cordell and Cordell's interests, you might think. But there's enough divorces that are just these inevitabilities for various reasons that we don't need to encourage people to choose divorce, and nor do we. None of our lawyers, at least not that I know of, and we have policies regarding this. So think about it. I know we've given you a lot here on your plate. I know that some of you watching this is very relevant to. Many of you watching are thinking, well, okay, it's good I know that. I hope I'm never where I need to use that information.
Right.
But we really wanted to do this show for those of you out here who are contemplating divorce, who are in a divorce, or maybe recently come out of a divorce. For those three groups, we know that this information is critical, and I'm confident it's not being dispensed elsewhere.
You can tell from the questions when people come in that this is information that isn't really being talked about. And so to have that information available and to just know it, I mean, it may never apply to you, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully it never applies to you. But if it does apply to you now, or if it comes up in the future, then this will give you some of those tools to be prepared for that and ask the right questions and sort of seek the right answers of what makes the most sense for you and what falls in line with your priorities.
Yeah. So I hope that this show has been helpful to you. We will do more shows in which we draw on the expertise of Cordell and Cordell on the domestic relations side. But this podcast will continue to be devoted primarily to estate planning. But I'm glad that we've acknowledged this relationship. It's uncanny how the more we thought about this in preparing for this show, how we thought, why is this not talked about more commonly? So I hope that you all agree. Incidentally, hit the like button, hit the subscribe, and we'll respond. So make comments, and anything I say to Wil, I think more of your comments would be to Wil relating to his side, which he views it from the divorce side. So be sure and follow up, touch base with Wil. He'll be happy to let us know. And we really like to have you respond and interact with the site. I don't need to tell you what you've heard many times on YouTube and elsewhere, is it's valuable to us for you to interact. And we really count on that. It tells us we're on the right track. And if we're not on the right track, let us know that too. Okay, so that wraps up this discussion. 3 episodes, 90 minutes. Did it feel
content.
Did it feel like we've had that much to say?
No.
But we did, and perhaps you can tell we could have said more. But I do hope that this was helpful to you. Those who have tuned in for all 3 episodes, I guess we did something right for sure in the first 2 episodes. And as for others that haven't watched those episodes, we encourage you to go back because what we said will make more sense. So this has been an episode of Life's Third Act. Till next time, take care.
We hope you enjoyed Life's Third Act, sponsored by Cordell and Cordell, your advisors for estate planning and beyond. Subscribe and join us weekly for thought-provoking discussion and topics exclusively focused on estate planning and your financial future. Discover more at CordellCordell.com. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.